I woke to the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the soft chirping of robins outside the window. The kitchen smelled faintly of last night's coffee, and I set about my routine almost mechanically, grinding fresh beans, filling the French press, and humming along with the morning news. My phone buzzed on the counter, another string of emails I knew I'd have to sift through before the day really began. As I brewed my coffee, I glanced at the unopened bills piled neatly near the toaster. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach, but I pushed it aside. I had responsibilities, always responsibilities, and letting a little anxiety take hold was not an option. Mark shuffled into the kitchen, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, murmuring a distracted "morning" before collapsing into a chair. He smiled faintly, polite but absent, as if the weight of some unseen thought pressed down on him. We exchanged a few perfunctory words about the weather and the mundane tasks of the day, but I could sense his mind drifting elsewhere. The calm of domestic life masked the tension simmering beneath the surface, a tension I had felt creeping in for weeks. Then it happened. Out of nowhere, the words landed like a punch to the gut. "You're a disgrace," my wife spat, her voice sharp and unyielding. I froze, coffee mug halfway to my lips as my colleagues, unexpectedly there for a casual morning drop-in, stared at me with wide eyes and awkward expressions. The room fell silent. Some tried to hide smirks, others shifted uneasily, unsure how to respond. My face flushed, heart pounding, as disbelief and humiliation collided. I struggled to maintain composure, forcing a polite smile. But inside, a storm raged. The betrayal stung more than any insult could, the word disgrace echoing relentlessly in my mind. And then she left me to handle it, leaving behind a demand I hadn't anticipated, a sudden $5,000 payment to be covered by me alone. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, heart hammering, mind racing with frustration and incredulity. Every click through the online payment portal felt like an exercise in endurance. I felt the weight of responsibility, the unfairness of expectation pressing down on me. This wasn't just money, it was a symbol of the repeated patterns I'd endured, the neglect and disregard masked by the veneer of family life. As the numbers scrolled past on the screen, memories of past indignities surfaced. Subtle dismissals at dinner, overlooked contributions, whispered criticisms that never reached anyone else but left me reeling. I questioned myself, wondering if I had been too soft, too accommodating. Should I speak up and risk further conflict, or stay silent, maintaining peace at the cost of my dignity? The tension was suffocating, yet I forced myself to breathe, to ground myself in reason rather than rage. Outside, a neighbor's car pulled into the driveway. Karen leaned over the fence, her eyes meeting mine with quiet understanding. "Sometimes your family is the one that hurts you most," she said softly. It wasn't advice exactly, more a recognition that resonated with everything I had been feeling. I nodded, appreciating the small connection, the acknowledgement that I was not entirely alone in this. My mind, ever alert, caught the subtle cues in her expression, the way her shoulders tensed just slightly, signaling she understood more than she let on. It was a reminder that intelligence and awareness were my allies, even when others seemed blind to the truth. My wristwatch lay on the counter, a habit of mine to remove it before handling bills. I picked it up, the familiar weight grounding me, a quiet symbol of pride and resilience. The scratches along its face told stories of decisions made, lessons learned, and dignity maintained despite repeated slights. Holding it, I felt a tiny spark of resolve, a whisper that one day the imbalance, the disrespect, would be addressed. The watch became a silent anchor, a reminder that my worth was not dictated by the hasty judgments of others. The morning stretched on, awkward and heavy, yet threaded with these small points of clarity. I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth soothe the sting of humiliation and the anxiety of looming responsibilities. Somewhere deep down, I knew the day was only beginning, and that each choice I made now would echo far beyond the walls of this kitchen. My mind was a careful balancing act between simmering anger and measured calm, a test of endurance I had faced too often. Yet through it all, I noticed the patterns, the repeated injustices, and quietly, almost imperceptibly, a plan for reclaiming control began to take shape. Even in the quiet, mundane moments, I could sense the shift, the subtle stirrings of self-respect ready to emerge stronger than before. And then, as if punctuating the chaos, a knock at the door broke my reverie. The timing was uncanny, the tension thick. My heart skipped, mind alert. "My name is Mark. Hello there. And you are?" I shut the bedroom door behind me and leaned against it, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The echoes of that morning, the laughter I imagined, the stifled smiles of colleagues, the sting of her words, were still pressing in on me. My hands trembled slightly as I sank onto the edge of the bed, running them through my hair. Shame mixed with a quiet anger, one that refused to surface fully, simmering beneath a controlled exterior. I whispered my thoughts aloud, trying to sort through the chaos in my mind. "How did it come to this?" I murmured, pen in hand, as I scribbled in my journal. Each line felt like an attempt to reclaim the self I thought I had lost, a tether to clarity amid the humiliation. The patterns of disregard were becoming clearer, the repetition undeniable, and with it came a cautious awareness that change was not just necessary, it was inevitable. I thought back to the countless small slights, the subtle undermining that had slipped by unnoticed over the years. The mornings she dismissed my input, the sharp tone she'd use when criticizing me in front of friends, the way she seemed to control the flow of conversation, dictating the narrative of our partnership. Recognition burned within me, not out of defeat, but a growing determination to see the reality for what it was. I weighed my options. Confrontation could lead to more humiliation. Silence might feel safe, but left me complicit. Patience demanded strategy. Each choice carried a weight I could not ignore. I realized that long-term neglect could only be countered with deliberate action, not emotional reaction. By mid-morning, I had settled at my desk, surrounded by financial statements, bills, and a laptop glowing softly in the morning light. I began composing emails, carefully choosing words that were neutral but assertive. My mind mapped out potential allies, friends who understood without judgment, family members who might intervene, neighbors who saw more than they let on. I documented the events of the past day with meticulous attention, noting discrepancies, the ways in which I had been left to shoulder responsibilities alone. "You don't have to tolerate disrespect in silence," I whispered to myself, the phrase solidifying into a quiet mantra. There was a subtle empowerment in this measured approach, a reclaiming of agency that no one could take from me. Later, the phone rang. It was Karen from next door, offering a soft check-in. I listened carefully, nodding even though she couldn't see me, parsing every word for intent. Some advice felt useful, some dangerously naive. I made mental notes, observing the slight shifts in her tone, the way she hesitated over certain suggestions. Social cues mattered now more than ever. Maintaining dignity while avoiding escalation required attention to every subtle signal. I appreciated the concern without surrendering control, recognizing the value of discretion over blunt confrontation. My gaze fell on the wristwatch resting beside me, its familiar weight grounding me once more. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand, the scratches and worn edges a testament to choices made, lessons learned, and pride preserved. Each glance reminded me of who I was and the principles I refused to compromise. Patience, strategy, self-respect, these were the quiet weapons I carried. The watch became a symbolic anchor, a mental checkpoint, a whisper that I would not allow myself to be diminished. The humiliation of that morning was real, but it would not define me. I sat in the silence, letting the weight of my thoughts settle. Confrontation might come, or perhaps the path forward would be quieter, more deliberate. The balance between patience and action weighed heavily, but I felt the stirrings of resolve, the quiet resentment transforming into a plan for measured response. The day stretched ahead, and with it, the first steps toward reclaiming control, dignity, and respect. The choices I made in the coming hours would ripple far beyond this room, shaping the course of the household, the marriage, and ultimately, myself. I knew that I couldn't stay silent forever, but how far would I have to go to be truly respected? The afternoon sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting stripes across the living room floor as I watched her move about the house. Every gesture, every glance, was cataloged in my mind like entries in a ledger I wasn't yet ready to share. She answered calls with practiced cheerfulness, nodded at neighbors who dropped by, and yet the subtle tensions in her tone betrayed an undercurrent I had long learned to notice. I noted the inconsistencies, the way she claimed one thing to me but let slip another to others. Patterns emerged quickly, small threads weaving a tapestry of control and manipulation I had endured for years. My heart held a steady rhythm, alert but measured, as I connected the dots between today's incidents and those that had humiliated me before. The quiet anger simmered, sharpened by recognition, but it was tempered by the knowledge that observation, not impulse, was my strongest weapon right now. By mid-afternoon, I had moved to my desk with a notebook open, pen poised. I reminded myself that reaction without strategy would only play into her hands. The thought of confronting her in the heat of a simmering argument felt reckless. Measured responses promised a far more enduring impact. I began planning. Small actions that asserted boundaries, quiet gestures of reclaiming authority, careful documentation of missteps and manipulations. I reviewed our finances, noting discrepancies she might have assumed I overlooked, and mentally rehearsed the way I would approach delicate topics. Measure twice, cut once, I reminded myself, letting the phrase anchor my cautious determination. Each choice became deliberate, each movement calculated, a quiet assertion that I would no longer be undermined without awareness or preparation. Later, I stepped out to the local cafe, blending into the soft hum of conversation while keeping a keen eye on interactions around me. Friends, acquaintances, and colleagues filled the room with casual chatter, unaware that I was assessing more than just the menu. I listened, watched, and noted subtle dynamics, the way some laughed a little too easily, others hesitated before offering support. Allies, potential witnesses, and even unintentional informants revealed themselves in body language and word choice. I inserted myself into conversations with the ease of familiarity, yet every smile and nod was filtered through the lens of observation. Each encounter sharpened my understanding of social influence, of the ways subtlety could be leveraged to protect dignity and gather intelligence. By the time I returned home, the mental map of relationships and potential leverage points felt clearer than it had in months. Back inside, I moved quietly, reclaiming small corners of control unnoticed. I paid a lingering bill that she had let slide, rearranged a shared space in a way that reminded both of us of household order, and observed her reactions from a distance. Each minor victory was a quiet assertion of self-respect, a psychological nudge that my presence and authority mattered. Control what you can, let go of what you cannot, I whispered to myself, relishing the subtle satisfaction that came from small, intentional actions. She moved through the rooms unaware of the shifts, and the sense of regained balance, though incremental, strengthened my resolve. Confidence seeped in quietly, a reassurance that strategy, patience, and precise action could reclaim what had been eroded over time. Evening settled in with a soft hush, the house quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. I sat with my notes spread before me, reviewing the day's observations, connecting threads, and anticipating what moves might come next. Patterns were evident now, the repetitions clear, her tendencies, the timing of provocations, the moments when attention or affection were manipulated, children's routines, neighbors' casual comments, and social perceptions all factored into the strategies I was constructing. Patience had its place, but the tension beneath the calm exterior warned that the time for action was approaching. I balanced emotion with calculation, steeling myself for the necessary confrontations while keeping each step deliberate and measured. The subtle battle had begun, and every observation and minor maneuver carried the weight of an inevitable escalation. I knew that patience alone wouldn't be enough. I had to act, but carefully, or risk losing everything. The evening air carried a soft chill as she moved through the house, preparing for an outing with that precise mixture of elegance and self-assurance that always set my nerves on edge. I watched quietly, noting the way she smoothed her dress, flicked her hair, and checked her reflection in the mirror more than once. There was a faint smirk in her expression, a sense of entitlement that hadn't gone unnoticed. I kept my own reactions measured, my voice calm when I offered a passing comment or a nod of approval. But inside, I braced myself. Each glance, each subtle gesture was catalogued and interpreted. The weight of prior humiliations pressed quietly behind my awareness, a steady reminder of why this moment demanded more than emotion. It required precision. I knew that a single misstep could give her leverage, so I centered myself, drawing on patience and clarity, ready to confront what had been brewing beneath the surface without revealing my hand. It was when I reviewed the bills and statements that I noticed it. A subtle but significant maneuver related to the $5,000 handbag she had insisted on purchasing. The charge had been shifted in a way I hadn't accounted for, a clever rearrangement that could have caused a ripple of embarrassment had I reacted impulsively. I paused, heart racing before letting a sense of quiet empowerment take hold. Knowledge is power, I reminded myself, allowing the realization to settle. Instead of letting shock dictate my behavior, I began plotting measured responses, controlled actions that would assert fairness and autonomy without drawing unnecessary attention. Each mental calculation included contingencies, a gentle correction in conversation, an adjusted financial move, a subtle acknowledgement of responsibility. It was enough to give me leverage, a tool to balance the scales without turning our evening into a public spectacle. Later, I accompanied her to the boutique gathering, walking beside her through the softly lit rooms filled with acquaintances and colleagues. My posture was calm, deliberate, projecting confidence without arrogance. I noticed how she moved, how she engaged with others, the slight inclinations of attention that indicated where her social power lay. Each interaction offered information, a glance that lingered too long, a laugh that carried a hidden edge, an assumption that could be quietly corrected. I joined conversations with a careful selection of words, maintaining eye contact where appropriate, offering input that was both polite and pointed. I let small pauses hang just long enough to observe reactions, measuring the subtle shifts in demeanor that indicated her awareness of my presence. The tension simmered, but I could feel the quiet assertion of control building with each measured step, each calculated smile, each calm but firm reply. The moment of minor victory came almost unexpectedly. She mentioned a small error in a shared account, confident it would embarrass me if I faltered. Instead, I responded with a concise correction, phrasing it lightly yet undeniably accurate. The shift was subtle, barely noticeable to the others around us, but her hesitation, the flicker of surprise in her eyes, was unmistakable. I felt a quiet satisfaction, a reinforcement of self-respect that had been slowly eroded over time. The gesture was small, almost symbolic, but it mattered. It reminded me, and quietly reminded her, that control was no longer hers alone. Each minor win accumulated, strengthening my resolve and shaping the strategy I would need for what lay ahead. Confidence flowed quietly, a steady current beneath the surface of polite conversation and elegant movements. By the time we returned home, the house felt different, charged with anticipation, though outwardly unchanged. I spread out my notes, reviewing observations, interactions, and financial nuances from the day. Patterns were emerging with greater clarity, and I considered next steps: how to assert influence, when to remain patient, and how to anticipate her reactions without revealing my intentions. The quiet war that had begun in small gestures and subtle corrections now promised escalation, the possibility of a more decisive confrontation looming in the near future. I centered myself, preparing mentally and emotionally, recognizing that courage would be necessary and hesitation could no longer be afforded. The calm before the storm was palpable, and I felt ready for the challenge that tomorrow would bring. Morning came quietly, the sunlight spilling softly across the bedroom floor, and for a moment I let myself just breathe. The subtle victories of the night before played back in my mind. The careful correction, the poised silence, the way her eyes had faltered for just a fraction of a second. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floorboards, running through the numbers in my head, thinking about the $5,000 handbag and the small but persistent manipulations that had threaded through our finances. There was that familiar knot of tension in my chest, a reminder of the weight I carried, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like preparation. Measure twice, cut once, I thought, recalling the advice my father had given me long ago. Today would require care, calculation, and patience, not haste or emotion. Each decision mattered, and I needed to be ready for what the day might reveal. I dressed slowly, methodically, letting my mind settle on the tasks ahead, aware that insight was the real power I could wield. The first real shock of the day came while reviewing statements and receipts, the kind of discovery that makes your stomach twist and your mind race simultaneously. Hidden in the accounts was a transfer I hadn't noticed, small enough to be easy to overlook, tied indirectly to her spending habits and her insistence on indulgences that carried consequences beyond what she acknowledged. My first reaction was disbelief, a cold tightening in my chest, but it didn't last long. Strategic resolve took its place. sharp and clear. I began mapping possible outcomes, weighing whether to confront this privately or let subtle measures shift the balance of power. Every angle demanded careful thought: how to prevent humiliation, how to assert boundaries, how to regain leverage without making a scene. I scribbled notes, rearranged calculations, and began to see the contours of a plan taking shape, a measured, deliberate reclaiming of control. Knowledge, once again, proved its quiet potency. Later, I made my way to the financial advisor's office, a modest building tucked just off the main street, and settled into the familiar leather chair. The advisor, a steady presence with decades of experience, listened patiently as I laid out what I had uncovered, occasionally raising an eyebrow, but never judgmentally. Together, we traced the threads of transfers, expenditures, and overlooked accounts, exploring realistic strategies for reclaiming control over shared finances. At moments, frustration bubbled beneath the surface, but it was tempered by clarity. Each revelation provided validation, not just of what had been done, but of what could be done. I left the office with a clear outline of measured responses, tools to assert control subtly, and a reinforced sense of empowerment. Walking to the cafe afterwards, I replayed conversations in my head, considered reactions, and refined my approach with the kind of mental rehearsal that turned insight into actionable steps. Back at home, I crafted a step-by-step plan. Each move had a purpose: a careful adjustment in accounts, a timely correction in conversation, a measured display of authority in social or public settings. I tested responses in my mind, anticipating her likely reactions, weighing the risks, and preparing counter-arguments for potential challenges. It was a game of patience and precision, and the more I mapped it out, the more confident I became. Minor satisfaction coursed through me, a quiet, controlled thrill at knowing that for once I held the initiative. The day's discoveries had shifted the terrain, and now I could navigate it with purpose and composure, knowing that impulsive emotion was no longer required to assert my standing. Evening arrived with a softness that contrasted the intensity of my internal calculations. I sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling beside me, reflecting on the day's revelations and my evolving strategy. The city outside the window seemed indifferent to the small victories and calculated moves I had orchestrated, yet within me, a quiet confidence had solidified. I rehearsed scenarios, imagined confrontations, and envisioned the subtle ways to assert authority without drawing unwanted attention. The tension that had built over months, perhaps years, now felt like a coiled spring, ready to release at the right moment. I knew that the coming days would test my strategy, that public or high-stakes exposure was inevitable. And yet, I felt ready, centered, and prepared to act with intelligence and resolve, my patience serving as armor against the uncertainty ahead. Tonight, the truth was closer to the surface than ever, and I would meet it deliberately, without hesitation. I woke before sunrise, the room still cloaked in a soft gray quiet. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I ran through the confrontation in my head again, line by line. I imagined the tilt of my shoulders, the steadiness of my voice, the calm in my eyes. The anticipation hummed beneath my skin, a low tension that sharpened focus rather than fear. I reviewed the discoveries from the previous days, the hidden transfers, the small betrayals that had accumulated like quietly dripping water. Each detail demanded respect, and I reminded myself, fortune favors the prepared mind. I checked a few discreet messages with friends, confirmations that support would be there if needed, yet I knew this was primarily my own battle. Everything depended on composure, on calculated words, on presence. I dressed slowly, deliberately, letting the ritual of preparation center me, and stepped out into the cool morning air, ready to meet the day's challenge head-on. By mid-morning, she arrived, sharp and seemingly composed, the usual faintly smug smile barely concealing tension. I greeted her politely, measured, observing every flicker in her expression, the way her hand hesitated on the coffee cup, the slight tightening of her jaw. We exchanged small talk, the cadence casual but precise, each line a probe, a test. I noted her slips, the subtle micro-expressions betraying discomfort. I allowed her to think she held control, while quietly asserting boundaries with each answer, each glance. It was a delicate dance, curiosity masked as civility, suspicion framed in calm. I felt the first surge of empowerment as small victories accumulated. Her posture shifted imperceptibly under observation, and I knew the advantage was tilting ever so slightly in my favor. The tension built like electricity, the calm before the inevitable storm. Then came the revelation, sudden and undeniable. A statement she casually left on the table, a note of a transfer, a receipt tucked in an envelope I had overlooked, proof of her secret maneuver tied to the $5,000 handbag incident and other indiscretions. My chest tightened for a moment. Disbelief flared. Then clarity struck. What's done in the dark will come to light, I reminded myself, steadying the surge of emotion. I assessed the implications, weighing public versus private consequences, shaping the confrontation in my mind. Each potential reaction she might have, each defensive posture, was considered, rehearsed, catalogued. My pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the precision of awareness, the realization that the advantage was now firmly in my hands. I watched her carefully, noting each subtle gesture, each hesitation, using them to craft the moment that would follow. When I spoke, my voice was calm, even, but carried the weight of undeniable truth. I presented the evidence, the transactions, the hidden manipulations, without raising my voice, without accusation laced in emotion. I let the facts speak, observed the shift in her demeanor. Surprise, guilt, subtle defensiveness. Every pause, every glance, confirmed the position I had carved for myself. I articulated the impact, not just financially, but personally, socially, and allowed the magnitude of her actions to settle between us. She attempted excuses, deflections, but the calm determination in my presence left no room for manipulation. I maintained composure, intellect, and subtle assertiveness, the quiet satisfaction of finally reclaiming control radiating from every measured word. By the time the encounter ended, I was seated back at my table, coffee cooling, a sense of relief mingling with lingering tension. The confrontation had gone as I had hoped. Dignity remained intact, leverage regained. I reviewed the day's events in my mind, mapping the possible repercussions, considering social and financial consequences, and planning the next steps with care. Each scenario was rehearsed, each boundary reinforced. A subtle satisfaction pulsed beneath the calm exterior. I had taken control, not through rash emotion, but through strategy and presence. And as I looked out at the quiet streets, I sensed something shifting beyond my immediate view, the ripple of my words extending further than anticipated. The private victory was set, public consequences were waiting to unfold, and I would be ready. I hadn't anticipated the ripple my words would send through their world. I arrived early at the community center, the morning sunlight spilling across the parking lot, warming the quiet tension I carried. The tables were neatly arranged, banners hung with precision, and familiar faces began trickling in. I scanned the room, noting those who mattered, the neighbors who would witness, the friends who had quietly supported me, the colleagues whose opinion carried weight. Every detail was cataloged, every potential reaction anticipated. I ran through the words I'd deliver if circumstances demanded, the tone measured, the demeanor unwavering. Keep your friends close and your truths closer, I reminded myself. I exchanged brief nods with a few allies, subtle confirmations that the timing was right, the stage set for what needed to happen. With each step I took through the crowded room, a steady resolve replaced the mild nervousness that lingered beneath my calm exterior. Everything depended on patience and careful observation. As the event picked up, I moved among the crowd, engaging casually with familiar faces while keeping an attentive eye on her. Small gestures, whispered comments, the subtle ripple of gossip, all of it painted a picture I could read like a map. I smiled, nodded, laughed lightly at innocuous remarks, but my mind remained sharp, noting the fleeting signs of unease when her name came up. I allowed the conversation to drift toward her recent actions without accusation, planting seeds of awareness. The controlled charm drew attention without suspicion, letting me subtly assert influence while measuring reactions. Each smile, each glance became data. The tension built slowly, a coil ready to spring, my anticipation mingling with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that preparation had brought me here, ready to shift the balance of power. When the moment came, I didn't rush. I gathered a small group near the central display and spoke calmly, presenting the facts with clarity and restraint. The receipts, the transfers, the small betrayals, they were all there, and the evidence could not be ignored. I let each piece of information land naturally, watched the expressions change, heard the collective murmur of disbelief spread through the circle. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues all registered shock, the subtle shift in the social dynamic unfolding before me. I caught her eyes, wide and flustered, the composure she had maintained evaporating as her defenses crumbled. The truth will out, I thought, the saying echoing in the background as murmurs turned to whispers, and whispers threatened to become undeniable acknowledgement. My presence remained calm, deliberate, letting the weight of fact, not anger, define the moment. The social power had quietly migrated, and I could see it settling squarely on my side. After the reveal, the room's atmosphere was charged, a delicate tension tempered by curiosity. Questions came in careful bursts, colleagues and neighbors seeking clarification or context. I answered with measured honesty, maintaining credibility, reinforcing the narrative I had prepared. Allies offered subtle support, nods or murmurs that bolstered the impression of fairness and control. The satisfaction of seeing justice take a social shape mingled with a vigilant awareness that this was only the beginning. Every reaction was a confirmation, every whispered conversation a proof of the shift. I reflected on the meticulous build-up, the strategy that had guided me from private preparation to public presentation, acknowledging quietly the patience it had demanded. The stage was set for broader ramifications, and I was ready for whatever came next. Later, stepping outside into the soft afternoon light, I allowed a brief pause to reflect. The confrontation in public had changed the dynamics irrevocably, but the subtle undertones of retaliation were already visible in her posture and distant glances. I considered the ripple effects, family conversations, social circles, the perception of power now unmistakably altered. Opportunities to establish lasting boundaries emerged alongside potential challenges. I reminded myself that intelligence, resilience, and strategic thinking had carried me here, and they would continue to serve. The day had reinforced lessons about asserting control, managing perception, and standing firm against betrayal. But as I caught sight of her across the crowd, whispering urgently to a friend, a shiver of awareness ran through me. I knew the truth was out, but as I saw her expression across the crowd, I realized the battle was far from over. Her next move could change everything. The morning felt unusually still as I reviewed the events from the public reveal, replaying every expression, every whispered comment. Sitting at my kitchen table with a notebook open, I went through my plan point by point, weighing each potential reaction. I knew she would try something, some countermove to reclaim ground, and I had to be ready. I made calls to a few trusted friends, subtle confirmations that they could step in if needed, and coordinated with my lawyer to ensure there was a formal path if things escalated. Speak your truth, even if your voice shakes. That saying resonated in my mind as I rehearsed, imagining the words flowing steadily, assertively. Every sentence I had prepared needed to land without hesitation, every fact presented without emotion clouding the delivery. The house was quiet, the air taut with expectation, and I felt the tension settle like a weight, sharpening my focus as the hours passed toward the confrontation. By mid-afternoon, I had gathered her in the formal meeting room, the lawyer present along with a few close friends who had been part of the previous chapter's subtle support network. I started calmly, referencing facts and observations from past weeks, outlining inconsistencies without raising my voice. The tension in the room grew with each carefully chosen sentence. She shifted in her chair, defensive at first, denying the claims with measured words, but I held my ground. Every question I asked exposed further cracks in her story, and I noticed the subtle signs of unease from the witnesses, small nods, furrowed brows, attentive glances. The balance of authority began tilting, almost imperceptibly, toward me. My calm control contrasted with her growing agitation, and I could see the realization forming that the game she had tried to play publicly and privately was no longer effective. Then came her move, a sudden attempt to regain control, raising threats of legal action and appealing to emotional guilt, trying to twist the narrative. My pulse quickened, but my voice remained steady. I presented clear, undeniable evidence, documents, messages, carefully logged timelines, that dismantled her claim instantly. The room's atmosphere shifted in a heartbeat. Friends and the mediator witnessed her credibility collapse, each attempt at manipulation falling flat. The adrenaline surged through me, yet I stayed composed, letting facts do the work, proving that preparation and resolve were the only tools needed to counter her. Fortune favors the prepared, I thought as I watched her defenses crumble. With her credibility destroyed, the tension softened. Witnesses nodded in subtle validation, acknowledging the shift in power. My allies offered quiet affirmations, and the lawyer's composed presence reinforced the finality of the situation. She could no longer challenge me without exposing herself further, and the social and family dynamics had realigned. I felt satisfaction, a controlled sense of relief, but remained alert, understanding that victory required ongoing vigilance. I reflected on the lessons of patience, strategy, and assertiveness, appreciating the growth that had brought me to this point. Boundaries were clear, my voice respected, and the strength of calculated action had proven itself. As evening settled over the house, I allowed myself a quiet moment to process the confrontation. The room had emptied, except for a lingering presence of evidence and the subtle echoes of conversation, and I recognized how far I had come. Personal resilience, careful strategy, and emotional control had turned what could have been chaos into resolution. I considered the implications for family interactions, social circles, and the sense of justice finally observed. Yet even in that calm, a message pinged on my phone, a reminder that life rarely grants complete closure. Just when I thought the storm had passed, a single message on my phone made my chest tighten. I realized the fight wasn't truly over yet. The message on my phone from the night before sat heavy in my hand. I stared at it for a long moment, tension coiling tight in my chest, before taking a slow breath. It was a reminder that even when you think a chapter is closed, life has a way of nudging at unfinished business. But I refused to let that unsettle me. I reviewed everything that had unfolded, the confrontations, the truths revealed, the subtle victories earned in quiet moments. I made mental notes, organizing priorities, reaffirming boundaries, and reminding myself that vigilance could exist alongside peace. Sitting in the living room with the afternoon sunlight stretching across the hardwood floor, I allowed myself a rare moment of calm. Don't let yesterday take up too much of today. That saying ran through my mind as both caution and encouragement. I picked up the notebook I'd left on the table, scribbled a few thoughts, and mapped the next steps to ensure safety and assertiveness without unnecessary confrontation. Even amid lingering shadows, I felt a cautious optimism rising, the kind born from experience and measured patience. Over the following days, I focused on tying up loose ends. Family misunderstandings were addressed directly but calmly, with clear evidence supporting my account of past events. Small moments of tension arose naturally. Someone misremembered a conversation or tried to frame a detail differently, but I had the clarity and composure to respond without letting anger cloud my judgment. Friends and allies reinforced my credibility quietly, backing up my version of events and showing that support was tangible, not just symbolic. The antagonist's influence had all but evaporated. Her minor attempts to interfere were deflected without drama, leaving me in full control of the narrative. In these interactions, I sensed a subtle realignment of social and familial respect, the kind that comes not from intimidation, but from demonstrated integrity. Life began to feel steadier, the chaos of deception replaced by measured action and thoughtful communication. I spent long evenings reflecting on how much I had learned. The years of subtle manipulation, betrayal, and testing had forged a kind of resilience I hadn't realized I possessed. I acknowledged the growth in myself, the ability to assert boundaries, to evaluate situations calmly, to act decisively while maintaining my composure. I thought about the sayings my grandmother used to repeat about perseverance and wisdom, and I saw their truth reflected in my own experiences. Gratitude welled within me, first for the allies who had quietly stood by me, and second for the inner strength that had carried me through. Each reflection reinforced a sense of emotional closure. I could see clearly now how dignity had been reclaimed and control restored, not through anger or vengeance, but through intelligence and calm determination. As the neighborhood stirred to life on a crisp morning, I reached out to friends and community members whose trust had wavered during past conflicts. I mended relationships where honesty and respect could still thrive, while quietly reinforcing boundaries to prevent future exploitation. Conversations were measured, grounded in shared understanding, and supported by visible actions that reinforced reliability and fairness. Slowly, a sense of community integration returned, the subtle influence I had built over the months solidifying into a foundation that could endure. I felt the weight of past mistakes lift slightly, replaced with an awareness that careful, deliberate actions created lasting change. By the time evening fell, I settled into a quiet reflection in the home that now felt fully my own. I thought about the path I had navigated, the confrontations, the strategic choices, the moments of restraint, and the times I had stood firm while others wavered. There was a peaceful triumph in knowing that life beyond conflict was possible, that autonomy and emotional freedom were real achievements. The wisdom gained, the lessons learned, and the strength demonstrated gave me confidence not just for today, but for whatever challenges might still arise. Finally, I could breathe, knowing that I had taken control of my life, and that nothing, not even the shadows of the past, could steal it from me again.